And that's the biggest thing is you don't really need the 4 years of computer science background. If you just start getting in there and start working with this stuff, you'll surprise
Mm.
yourself how easy it is to start to manipulate data with a few strings of code.
What if I told you that your entire perspective on GIS and geospatial careers is about to shift? Today's guest didn't start in geography, he came from data analytics, but when he discovered GIS, it changed everything. From obsessing over maps of Middle Earth as a kid to running enterprise GIS systems, his journey is proof that modern GIS is evolving fast. In this episode, I have a chat with David Price, GIS manager in Bowling Green, Ohio, and ERISA Vanguard cabinet member. And we're diving deep into the future of GIS education, why traditional degrees might not be enough, and how you can stay ahead by learning coding, spatial data science, and open source tools. Plus, we're going to talk about a big question that's on everyone's mind. Will GIS professionals who don't learn to code get left behind? If you've ever wondered what it really takes to succeed in GIS today, this episode is for you. All right, David, welcome. Thanks for grabbing some time to join me here today. David, you are the GIS project manager at in Wood County in Ohio. And yeah, I just wanted to let you introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Matt. And thanks for inviting me on, having the time to make this work. I'm really excited. As you said, I'm the GIS project manager for Wood County in Northwest Ohio. I've been in the position a few years now, and I'm getting excited to talk about GIS education. I don't have I'm not super connected in education. I sit on the advisory board for the University of Toledo for our geography and planning. I'm kind of the young head that they brought in to get some new ideas going, get somebody who's in the area who works in the geospatial world to get some ideas flowing. And so sort of off the back of that, when I saw that you were interested in bringing guys on to talk about different things, I immediately thought, how about we talk about GIS and the education surrounding it in the geospatial world? So yeah.
Yeah, I think it'll be good to get into some of the like educational tracks and how you've seen that. Of course, you're coming to it from an outside perspective, as it were. But I think kind of going to there and getting through all that will be interesting. But I think as like many of us that end up in this space, of course, you've had an interest in geospatial or maps or things like that. From a young age. I mean, I remember the same for me. I had this atlas. I think I won it in third grade, and the thing is probably falling apart somewhere at this point, but it was one of those things that always kind of drew you in. So it's not, when we talked the first time, you were the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing that I always point out is I got to give Tolkien his dues. Huge Lord of the Rings fan, and the Middle Earth map, just being able to, I got a copy of the Silmarillion when I was young because that's how into it I'd like to read the textbooks too, not just the actual lore. And it had a fold out map. And I just remember obsessing over Middle Earth and really, really enjoying the world building aspect of mapping. And, it was something that I was always interested in. And I did it myself, and I did world building, and I drew my own maps. And then, I shelved it for 10 years when I got into high school, and it became a little too nerdy or whatever I thought it was, and eventually I, bounced around. I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do with myself in university. And I landed in a data analytics track where I was introduced into GIS. And then I was like, it just blew the doors off. I'm like, maps are back. I want to build maps. I want to use geospatial data to drive analysis. So yeah, I mean, that's how I got into GIS. I come from a data analytics background. So it's a little bit different than the normal geography track,
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your kind of like educational path, because I think it'll set up for the conversation later. You obviously have a degree in or a focus area in data analytics, and kind of how did you get to that, and then how did you eventually morph that into a career in GIS?
Yeah, so I came off the back of an associate's degree at our local community college because I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I wanted cheap education, get my foot in the door, start working, start doing stuff. So I got a psychology degree, and then just looking at the next steps, and I'm looking at the University of Toledo, which is the area that I'm from. And all of a sudden I noticed, oh, they have a data analytics program. And it was new at the time, relatively uncharted territories for the University of Toledo. And I got to sit down and speak with the chair who created the program and, pick his brain. And I was super, super interested. And I've always been a data guy, data first. I want to use data, analyze data, and use it to drive decisions. That's it's what I like to do. A lot of people look at me and it's like, this dude's a weirdo. But, I think a lot of people will out there kind of agree and understand what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something where everyone that I know in this space is very. You hear a statement and then you start to go back to like, give me the facts, and you want to prove that out with data or something like that. So going in from the data analytics side, what were some of the things that you started to learn or the skills that you practiced in that program? And did those transfer over to geospatial, or was it like a whole new learning curve once you started to move into the GIS space?
There's definitely a lot of overlap, especially coming from learning more fundamental programming and having a strong background in SQL. Understanding SQL was huge because I feel like in the normal GIS track, you get a little bit of it with Query Builder and the things inside of some of inside of the Esri products that just come stock. And I think that's where I honestly have the edge, coming from more of a data background and coming from more of a computer science background. Allows me to interact with the data on a much more granular level than it would be just somebody who's learned to push buttons in an interface.
Having come from a technical background, learning programming, SQL, Python, things like that. How was it picking up the geospatial side, the GIS side, and where were there roadblocks, if any?
Yeah, I think honestly the major roadblocks for me was trying to come in and understand the UI. Like, I'm just gonna run geoprocessing tools. I'm gonna search the little tool in the toolbox and I'm gonna run it. What actually blew the doors off for me was understanding that when you go and you use those geoprocessing tools, next to the run button in ArcMap or ArcPro, there's a little 3 dots, and you can select that and you can actually grab the code out and you can understand what is this tool actually doing. And I think getting beyond sort of the black box, like, here's a tool, and if you input some data, it will do something to it. Actually getting into that nitty gritty, because I come from reading code and developing, it provided that insight that I was sort of missing. But I don't think the relationship is exactly the same, on the other end. It's not mirrored, like you were saying. You hit the nail on the head. It's much more difficult for somebody who understands mapping and cartography and geography and has a good understanding of how Esri products work, for them to then go in and understand programming and getting into Python or JavaScript or something like that. I feel like is much, much, much more difficult. And actually, I have people that reach out to me all the time, international students and different people on LinkedIn looking for jobs, trying to understand how can I make myself more competitive. And a lot of the things that I hear is that people worry that they're going to get pushed out by people who have more of a competitive computer science background. They just don't think, how can I hack it against somebody who can write a Python script when all I can do is, use the interface that I know of and that I'm aware of. And so I think that there's a lot of room for growth in terms of adding in just general beginner coding lessons in work plan for just a standard GIS bachelor's undergrad program. I think that we need to really try to focus a little bit more on just showing people, like giving people a taste. A little introduction is really all you need nowadays with the capabilities that we have with AI. I think honestly, you need to understand generally how scripts are set up. But I think it's never been easier to learn programming than it is in the modern era right now, especially even coming from a GIS background. It's never been easier. It's still very, very, very scary for somebody who has never touched it before, though. And I think a lot of people are still tell themselves they can't do it. And that's the biggest thing is you don't really need the 4 years of computer science background. If you just start getting in there and start working with this stuff, you'll surprise yourself how easy it is to start to manipulate data with a few strings of code. You don't have to write a 100, 200 page script or application. It really can be quite simple with some rudimentary ArcPy functions. And then all of a sudden you're manipulating data and you're like, oh God, I can do a lot with this,
Yeah. I think the biggest takeaway I would say to that is that you have a lot of people that can write good code. That's a very good skill to have, and applied across anything: data engineering, data science, software engineering, whatever that might be. What you do have as a GIS practitioner, even if you're just using ArcGIS Pro, QGIS, anything like that, is no matter what you did, you do understand spatial thinking, and understanding spatial thinking as it relates to data and how you manipulate and work with data. That in and of itself is an important skill. and I try not to tell people, like, don't underplay that. You're still doing something incredibly valuable, even if that is. Now, how you transfer that thinking and express that through Python or SQL, that's like the next level up that I think you probably got to put those two together pretty quickly, right? And you could say, yes, oh, I understand that, doing a spatial join looks like this, and here's how I would express that. Or maybe something as complex as like nearest neighbors, or those types of things. Once you understand how data and code work, you can start to express those things, through the spatial libraries that exist. And I think, that certainly is one key part of that. But as you've started to grow your career, and I think one thing you said that was like how practitioner or practicing, I guess, is the way to put it, like doing that and analytics and those types of processes is one piece, but then jumping into a larger organization or an enterprise or something like that becomes a whole other ball game. Like what were your experiences with doing those types of things?
Yeah, so I guess to backtrack slightly, like I said, I come from a data analytics background, so I probably didn't have the same number of GIS and geography courses that somebody would, who's majoring in GIS. But what I really noticed about GIS courses is that there's a lack of large scale enterprise experience because these universities aren't going to be able to afford to do an enterprise deployment just to sort of teach people how to interact with it. So I guess what I would say is if you think you understand GIS because you took some college courses, you really need to wait until you understand what an enterprise deployment is, because it's a beast. Thankfully, I was able to come into a situation where I had a database administrator and I also had a GIS analyst underneath me who were able to help me sort of get my feet and understand, okay, wow, an enterprise system offers a lot of things that I've never even heard of, that weren't even touched on in my program at all. And just to throw a few of those things out there, I mean, obviously coding behind the basics, but even just like something as simple as working with an API, how to extract data out of an API, how to push data through, how to handle GeoJSON, anything like that, even real-time data applications, was something that I never had any experience with. And when I was able to teach myself how to do those things, again, it blew the doors off not only my own understanding of GIS, but my superiors, my coworkers, the people that I work with were like, you're grabbing real-time weather data anytime I drop a point out there? Like, you could do that? And I was kind of in the same boat. I was like, yeah, I guess I can do that. I didn't even really know, but we figured it out, right? And just like those little things where I feel like if we could sort of bite down a little bit harder on those early GIS courses, I wouldn't have been sitting there thinking that I made some huge win out of something that's really not that difficult to do,
Right. Yeah, there is this gap between, and it's something I know we'll get into a little bit later, but like how do you learn those programming fundamentals, and do you need a degree to do that, or certification, or whatever that might be? And I think there's I mean, I have my thoughts, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but you said something there that I wanted to point out, which was, kind of getting connected and, doing more than maybe was just demanded, right? You're kind of, how do you get plugged in? How do you do more than just simply relying on the degree that you have, and use the people and experiences around you to grow your knowledge and your career? Like what else, what extra did you do to decide besides just that in the day-to-day to kind of expand your skill set, knowledge, so forth?
I think we are really, really blessed in our industry that there are so many fanatics out there. If you want to get plugged in and you want to do more and you want to learn, there's spaces and opportunities out there. So for me, the biggest one for me right off the rip would be formerly known as ERISA, GPN now is what they're calling it, the Geospatial Professional Network. That had a huge impact in me right out of school because I feel like I didn't get sort of a full GIS education. Being able to go to some of their conferences and hook up with some of those people in that organization and speak to them about what they learned, it's irreplaceable. I mean, you really can't replace the institutional knowledge that somebody else has of our industry. And so I would say, immediately once you graduate, you got to start jumping in, look for a local state organization, look for your ERISA chapter in your region, and then obviously big ERISA, formerly ERISA, Geospatial Professional Network. It's going to be difficult for me to lock that one in, but it's a fantastic group. They, hold different things all over the place. Their major conferences, GIS Pro, I've spoke at and heard many, many, many fantastic presentations given there. If you have any interest in continuing education, I think the first places that you should look at are these sort of larger national level and even global level organizations.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I benefited a lot from learning in my early career from people around me. And I think that that's one place you can go. But I didn't take the extra step of kind of like plugging into those extra organizations, namely I didn't know, but there were, well, that's not entirely true. There were, at the time in New York, when I landed here, there were a lot of like meetups. It was kind of, still the big thing, like meetup.com. I don't know if that's still, if people are still doing that, but that's another one that I was, definitely, they had these great Geo NYC meetups. So you got to meet a lot of people and, connect and do a lot of those different things. So I find those organizations, and there's quite a few of them. The Geospatial Professional Network, I'll use the, formerly known as ERISA, and even like the Cloud Native Geospatial Forum. There's ways to connect and get in on top of these. So that's definitely a good place to go. So describe like kind of your day to day. I know like you're kind of using a lot of the Esri ecosystem. How do you do that? What are you doing? What's your views on kind of an Esri centric kind of deployment, and how do you what do you do with all that?
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm going to backtrack very briefly, just what we were speaking on earlier. If you happen to live in an area where there aren't a lot of in-person meetups, or you're not seeing Mappy hours in your area, or there just isn't because you're a one-stop shop in a county of 30,000 people and you just can't meet up with other people, the spaces online, they really, since the pandemic, I mean, there are ways to get plugged in and meet different people. And LinkedIn can be such a pain, but it is a great tool. At the end of the day, it is a fantastic tool. And there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of fanatics also in our industry on LinkedIn. It's a great way to, hear people's thoughts, get their opinions on a whole host of things. And because our industry is growing and changing so quickly, it's a great way to stay up to date with different things. Esri likes to say they put 30% of their profit back into research and development. So if they are really researching and developing 30% of all of that revenue or profit, there's tons and tons and tons of things to keep up with all the time. So now rolling that into what I do, yes, I mean we're an Esri shop. We mainly use Arc Pro and an enterprise deployment to handle the majority of our data. That being said, Esri is not the only tool in our tool belt. We do a lot of other things. We use a lot of different data manipulation techniques and different things, and I'm all about open source. So when I can, I like to fact check isn't quite the right word, but I like to do things twice. Sometimes I like to do them first in an Esri environment, and then I do them again in sort of a open source geospatial environment, and then I decide which one was easier and which makes the most sense for us to continue down this process. And so I think the one example that I had given you when we spoke before was about image classification for building footprints. And so you can build a nice little model in Esri's ecosystem, and you can run your imagery through it, and it can pull out all of the, you train it up, and it pulls out all of the building footprints for you. And then so what I did is I then tapped the OpenStreetMap API. Now that I can work with APIs, okay, I have been able to for quite a few years, but just to give a little callback. So now that I have that ability, I can just immediately, boom, pull in. OpenStreetMaps has a building footprints data layer that they maintain that is extremely accurate. I'm shocked that it's as up to date as it is in my town. I live in a college town, Bowling Green. And so we pretty constantly have things, frat houses move or they build a new stadium. And so I was going and I was looking back, and we hadn't done a building footprints analysis probably for maybe 3 or 4 years. Anyways, there was a new basketball arena that wasn't in there, and Greek Life had moved to a new location. And so those are a couple of my test areas. And not only did Esri's process work 100% very fine, but when I was able to check it against the OpenStreetMaps API, I was surprised to see how up to date that their data was out there. And so that's just one small example of being able to guess and check and make use of multiple tools. That's my main thing, is that you don't ever want to be solely reliant on Esri products. I mean, they have a fantastic ecosystem, but it's a bit of a walled garden, and it can be difficult to, find a workaround or find another way to do something. If you, for example, incur an error 99999 and you can't get any information out of the debug, and you're like, what the heck? I'm going to just go take this into queue and we're going to do it that way, because there's 3 plugins that say they can do the same thing. So let's start working through those processes, and it's just having the ability to think differently and to use a different option and to say, maybe this is actually easier,
Right. Yeah. It's not one or the other, which, I mean, it's a both or all. So yeah, I think having that, hybrid approach is one thing I'm hearing a lot from different folks in the market that are, using either side of the equation, right? More, non-Esri tools or Esri tools. They want to be able to integrate all these pieces together. So from someone who's done that successfully, can you give a few other examples of how you're doing that? Or yeah, do you have some real world examples?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind would be sort of I guess this came off the back of not necessarily cost cutting, but trying to be most cost efficient. Currently we have one like 3D analyst license right now in my organization. And I have it assigned to my GIS analyst. And so anytime that I need to make use of that package, instead of, I could go in and turn it off for him and switch it back over to my account, turn it on for me. But instead of worrying about all that, because he doesn't have such a strong background in the open source side of things, I just let him use it. And then anytime I need to do like, say, LiDAR analysis or generate some contours for a region, and I would use the tools in that license package, I just use open source tools. Usually I just use Q because the plugins are so nice, but if I have to, I'll pull it into Python and do some manipulations there. I don't know, I guess I do try to stay in mapping interfaces when I can, at least Q or Esri, just because I think it sort of helps paint the picture for me. But there's no reason why you couldn't just do this solely in like a Jupyter notebook or a Jupyter lab or something like that, and generate the geometries in the output anyways. I just like to see the output in the UI. So I tend to make use of a lot of QGIS plugins, especially in the cases where we're not going to pay to buy another license. There's open source tools out here that can do those things. So yeah, that's one of the main ways that we make use of open source, is to sort of ease our burdens on the back end and remain more efficient and not have to swap licenses all the time or worry about, I got to call down to the guy in the auditor's office and see if he's using this right now. Or in Ohio, we have auditors. Everybody else has assessors. It's very fun. But I'll end it there, at least on the integration portion. Those are the main ways that we make use of open source. It's kind of just a stopgap, but it's like I keep saying, the more tools you have in the belt, the better you're going to be long term to tackle any sort of problem.
Right, and that's at the core of what modern GIS should be, right? It's the interoperability or flexibility, whatever, however you want to put that, but the ability to move between tools, between data sizes, between data sets, systems, local cloud, whatever that might be. It allows for each tool to do what it can do really well. And I think that's one thing that I notice starting to take hold a little bit in geospatial, is that, you don't have to be the end all be all. You don't have to have, kind of, to pull back to a Tolkien reference, one ring to rule them all. You can have, many mythical rings, to just keep going on to that. You can wear multiple ones and do different things together and, collaborate, as it were. So that I like hearing about that and hearing that in practice, and even going from, we're not just talking about large organizations here. We're talking about people doing this in, governments of all sizes and scales, so I think it's great to hear that. Now, getting back to education, obviously, this is one thing that came up quite a bit when we were talking about how and what should an education or a well-rounded geospatial education look like. I think there's a few points that are, I personally have that I think, but I've been out of the game for a while. I graduated in 2010, so that's, yikes, 15 years ago now. So, tell me, from your perspective, what your take is on the state of GIS or geospatial education.
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit earlier. And again, a lot of this, we got to understand, is from my anecdotal experience and the way that I interacted with the GIS courses I took in my undergrad. But all of that being said, I think there is a little bit too much of a reliance on the Esri products. Like I said, it's sort of a walled garden, and they're doing a lot to remedy that, and they're making an ease of interoperability for file types and different things. Like one example I can give right now that's fresh in my mind is there's a new integration between ArcGIS Pro and AutoCAD Civil 3D for engineers. And so I do a lot of work in our engineer's office. That's technically where I'm at. My position is under. And so we do a lot of sharing of geospatial data for plans and presets, and that's a beautiful backdoor that they just created to share geospatial data with AutoCAD, and I think that's a fantastic thing. And Esri needs to keep moving in that direction, where they're trying to bring other players in and say, look, we want if you have data in these other places, we want you to be able to use it with our software as well. So kind of getting a little bit off track there, but some other things that I would like to see in a GIS coursework for an undergraduate would just be a little bit of a stronger programming data background. And I think it would be interesting to see courses allow you to get a concentration. So like for my data analytics background, I have a concentration in geospatial data. So that's why I took an increase in GIS courses and those types of things. But I would like to see it, maybe being able to specialize, whether you want to be more purely cartographic, or if you want to get into the computer science things, maybe you can specialize in Python, where you see a track where you take a few additional Python courses. Or maybe you're more of a web development person, so you take a couple of courses with JavaScript and CSS and some of the more classic web development languages. And then it just gives you an opportunity to interact with those languages and see if it's something you like. You don't necessarily have to, all of a sudden, Python just isn't doing it for me. Maybe I'm really not, the programmer I thought I was, or it's just, it feels like I'm banging my head into a wall every time I start to open up a new script and it's just not working for you. So, it could help sort of guide somebody in their path while they're in university, and they don't have to come out and then go, oh God, I wish I would have been learning this, 5 years ago.
Yeah, I had that a very similar experience. I came out of school and a lot of my work was focused on the cartographic angle, which is not the work I do today, right? It was cartographic design, and then the interactive or the programming part was through interactive mapping, which was kind of the focus at the time. What I learned I really liked to do was the analytical work, the data work, and I didn't know that. I don't think that was like any fault of my program or anything like that. I just think I didn't know what I didn't know yet, and that what I was fortunate to come away with was a little bit of understanding of programming languages. I did have a massive amount of work to pick that up. And I think I've told this story on parts of the internet at different times, but, it was probably a little bit different from you, where I'm coming from the background. I know the geospatial stuff, and I learned it. I understand it. I took a lot of like the human geography stuff. So I have this like kind of background in these pieces too, but I had to pick up all the programming, from scratch, trial and error, Medium articles, YouTube videos, starts and stops on online courses, that you name it. Right. And of course, the whole time I was like, do I need to go back to school to learn this stuff? I'm kind of like, but every time I found myself asking that question, I would kind of go benchmark against programs, say like, well, maybe I don't need to. And maybe, it always kind of feels like a chip on my shoulder where I'm like, well, I never went back for a master's, or did I need one? Or I don't know, or, so I agree is that there should be more of those pieces in those programs. Either from a programming side, should you want to learn that or need to learn it, I do believe it does help from a salary perspective, and those jobs are generally pay a little bit more. I'm not saying that's not everyone needs that, of course, but it as an offering, I believe that's there. And I think, like you said, kind of having these concentrations that allow people from other areas of study within a university system to come in and learn that as well. Pick up the pieces that they need for geospatial. Maybe they just need a few things to do what they need to do, but they can actually do that and then go apply it to whatever work they're doing from different parts of a program. So I think those things are there as well. But as to learn programming alone, and you can tell me your perspective on this, like I think there's a lot of that you can learn kind of in, on the job or professionally, sort of through like, professional learning endeavors, be that online or whatever that is. It's hard, but I believe that is doable. What's your take on something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's, more resources than ever, I think, to learn programming on the fly. And alongside of, Copilot and these things that are built right into GitHub or VS Code or whatever it is. I mean, you got these options where there's a lot more hand-holding these days. And I feel like it's a lot easier to pick it up because you don't have to necessarily get into debugging, because the error just tells you, hey, go to line 137. You missed a comma, dude. You're not going through and looking and being like, where the heck is that one little curly brace that I put in the wrong spot, or needs to be indented one more than it is, or whatever the case is, So I think it's there is less and less ability to fail to actually learn programming than there ever has been before. And I think one of the key reasons why people fail is because early on they look at chapters 1, 2, and 3 in the free Python learning catalogs, and they get bored. They're like, I don't care about creating lists. I don't need to, because they don't understand what it can do eventually. But I don't know. I've had success in telling people to maybe skip a few chapters ahead and learn to write a basic function, and then you kind of just sort of pick it up all in one at that point.
Yeah.
And then if your function is not 100% up to par, you just dump it into one of these large language models and you say, what the heck's going on here? And it outputs something and you use it and you bounce it back and forth. And no, I mean, they don't write perfect code, but their ability to help you understand code that you might not necessarily understand is pretty powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Using the AI models and large language models is, I think, definitely a topic, a whole other topic that was, but what I will say, if anyone's, curious, should I use them? Is that cheating? Which I've certainly felt like I'm cheating sometimes by doing that. I think use them as tools. If you try to get them to write the code for you, you will probably be hitting a lot of walls, right? But having a base understanding and being able to apply that and then using that to accelerate your work or help you solve a problem, treat it like a colleague or someone that you can bounce an idea off of, rather than going through Stack Overflow links from 5 years ago and trying to figure that out. That's my high level perspective on AI. But I'm glad you brought that up, as it's a good tool to kind of sharpen your skills or help you get around a problem and go faster. So yeah, we kind of talked, I think, what do you see changing, or what things would be good to change from your perspective in a GIS education?
It's so tough because people come into it with different ideas and from different backgrounds, and they want to do different things with it. If somebody is like, I want to make National Geographic style maps, and that's what they want, and their idea is hardcore beautiful cartography, and that's their thing. The traditional track that we have right now through a geography department and program, I think is fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but I do think that as GIS grows and grows and geospatial grows and grows, there's so much more of a reliance on understanding the nitty gritty in the back end. So I would say an increase in database stuff, more than just an SQL query builder. Let's actually understand how SQL works. And then beyond that, it's tough because there is no real enterprise architecture built into these universities, but having a course that teaches you, this is the web adapter and this is how the web adapter works and how it interacts with, the server, a federated server, and how all of these things tie together. I mean, I just showed up to my first job that had an enterprise deployment and had to learn on the fly, So I'm going through Esri documentation, trying to figure out how do all these things link together? Why does IT have my web adapter, siloed on a separate server? So this stuff isn't making sense. And then, starting to walk through and have a better understanding of, the reasons these are set up this way is because, he spun up a server it's not necessarily on-prem, it's a virtual server and this and that. And so there's so much back-end stuff that I think would be very beneficial to have somewhat of an understanding of. You don't have to be a database administrator. You don't have to be an IT director. You don't have to know everything ins and outs about how computers transfer data, share data, store data, but just to have, somewhat of a peek behind the curtain to where you're not just interacting with data solely in a pretty UI, I think would just benefit our industry as a whole.
Yeah, I agree. I think the getting down to the data level and understanding those little fundamentals can help change things dramatically. And even if you're not expressing that through code, right? Even if you're expressing that through a UI or, a dashboard or something like that, it can dramatically help how you do things and understand how to make things more efficient, right? Because once you understand how the system works, should you need to move to code, great, you can, but you can also improve speed and performance in other places as well. Little things like, I don't need a geometry for every single row if the things are repeating. I can join that. There's all these little lessons that you can kind of learn along the way, but that's important. Can you talk a little bit about you said you started with an associate's degree and then moved into your 4-year after that. I know I'm assuming your associate's degree is not GIS related, right?
No, it was in psychology.
Got it. What do you, I mean, having gone through a 2-year program, I personally think that there should be 2-year programs for GIS and geospatial. What would your take on that be?
Yeah, I think that I think if we had something like that set up that was relatively accepted across the larger United States, we would see a huge increase in our local counties' ability to work with this type of data. I think that's one of the main hindrances is that a lot of people, whether they go and they just get their bachelor's or they go and they get their bachelor's and then they get a master's right after it, once you've reached that step where you've already got a master's, you've basically priced yourself out of every entry level job at the county level. You know what I mean? Which is a perfect place to get your foot in the door. You're only going to be doing 30 hours of work a week. So you got 10 hours that you can learn and teach and try to understand more and more and more geospatial things. And so I think having a 2-year degree would really, really benefit those types of positions and people who can then decide, this is for me, or, hey, I'm happy at the county level. I'm going to stay here, ride it out, get my pension, do whatever, and they can just stay there. Or they have the ability to say, hey, this is my passion. I am passionate about this. I'd like to go back to school and I'd like to continue with maybe more of a pure cartography background. Or no, I actually really enjoy manipulating data and doing the analysis and driving decisions. So I want to end up with more of a data-driven background or a programming background. I think, I would be a huge proponent of something like that. I would love to see that in our local community colleges and 2-year accredited schools and stuff.
Yeah, they do exist. I a few, maybe 2 years ago, I went through and tried to make a list of all the programs that I could find for geospatial in the U.S. and they are out there. So it's certainly, but it's not the norm. And I think it would be cool to see what that could do to our industry as well. On the same token, certifications, things like GISPs, stuff like that. How do you see those impacting the landscape today?
Yeah, the GISP is a really, really interesting one for me, especially, I guess, sort of coming into GIS a little bit later than most people. So right when I graduated from high school is when they decided that the GISP was going to be more than just a portfolio review. I believe that was 2015 was when that changed. So most people who have a GISP pre-2015 were basically grandfathered in. They didn't have to take the test. They did have to provide a portfolio and have it reviewed by the GISP Institute or whatever they're calling themselves. Now there is a 120 question test and you get whatever, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, something to that effect. So there is a testing portion. And I've heard from, peers and young professionals like myself, I think we kind of get a little bitter about it because we weren't grandfathered in. And now we have to take a test where I've heard there's things as wonky as trying to calculate projections by hand. No idea if that's true. I'm sure that's some fear mongering behind all of this, but the one thing that I would say is I'm not particularly drawn to getting a GISP out of my own pocket. I think if my work was willing to back that, it's absolutely something that's going to look good on your resume, but it's such a niche thing that unless your hiring manager is a geospatial person, the odds of them recognizing the GISP and understanding what it actually means and the value it derives, I think is less and less. If you're looking at 2 resumes and somebody has a GISP and somebody has a PMP, project management certification, I personally, I think from my experience, they're going to go with, I know that this person has project management experience and they've gotten a certificate and they've gone through that. And it's going to be a little bit stronger than the GISP is, given if it's an incredibly, spatial, geospatial job, then yes, maybe they might be looking out for that. But it's one of those that kind of rides the line. It's difficult to get back to organizations. Like I know Urissa is very involved with the GISP and they like to promote it and they always bring a table out to have them there. And it's just interesting, you'll come into these different places where people will tell you different things about it. And at the end of the day, you have to make your own decision on whether, which certification is right for you and what you intend to do with the rest of your career. But it puts us at an interesting crossroads, I would say, as geospatial folk. And I would be, not that I want to, promote some sort of uprising or something to rival it, but I would be interesting to see what other sort of certifications could come in the future and could have the backing of some sort of larger institutions. Like there's really nothing that gives the GISP any power. It's not, it's not an ASCI. It's not part of the Bar Association. It's not backed by any of the engineering associations. So, I would like to see something that has more accreditation to it that would, eventually create a stronger certificate. But again, I mean, if the opportunity arises for me to get one, I absolutely would get one. I do think that they carry water right now as is.
Yeah. I mean, it speaks to there are organizations out there that you can start to join and work with in the professional setting, right? I think that what's happened in my mind is I think our space has just evolved, and all the concentric circles around GIS, from geospatial, cloud native, programming, all these things have just started to grow, and they need their own support system too. And frankly, that's why I got in. I'm sure this is why you are discussing and sharing all the great things that you are as well. It's kind of why I got started too, because there wasn't that, there wasn't those conversations happening. There's certainly, our events, there's Phosphor G, and they have a great, kind of event every year in different parts of the world. So these things happen, but I just didn't see that carried in a way that I was like, okay, I can, learn and relate from that. And I think that's kind of what if I had to pinpoint anything, how do we start to formalize the results that people can get from learning those things? And that's what I would love to see start to happen.
It's really interesting. And, that's how I initially came across you and your videos, was because I was searching for something more, I was looking for a little bit of a more granular take on some of those circles that are growing, because I have, sort of saw, hey, wait a minute, I don't really know exactly what I'm doing with that. I should learn it, and starting to jump around and find places where I can get involved and learn those things that grow or that are continuing to grow. And as technology grows, our industry is going to just, like you said, more and more and more and more, and it's never going to stop. The continuing ed will go on forever, right? So it's not like you're ever going to create a perfect undergraduate GIS program. It won't exist, but we can narrow and we can get a little bit more of a finer scope, especially with things like concentrations and things like we touched on.
For sure. Well, we covered a lot of ground. I think, it's really cool to hear your background. Like I said, coming from an outside perspective, doing this, learning it, being successful, and then understanding how to weave two worlds together really is kind of, from the GIS world and the broader data analytics world, bringing those two things and creating a balance, and then how we can actually educate and share that forward. I think it's a really good vision. And I think, understanding how to do that across all the places that need professionals in our field, and you're certainly an example, a very good example of that. So I appreciate, taking the time. Anything else that you wanted to leave the folks with today?
Yeah, you know what? Just popped into my head. I don't think I brought it up when we were speaking about associations. I know I mentioned, if you're in a rural area, you don't have an association close to you. I would encourage you to start one. I'm a founding board member of the County Geospatial Association of Ohio. We started in August of 2023, and by October of 2023, we had over 75 of the 88 counties in Ohio. 70 to 75, don't quote me on that, but we saw a huge, there's an appetite out there for folks around you that want to get into geospatial and want to learn more and want to be involved. So I would encourage you, if you're out there and you're like, there's nobody in whatever Northwest Mississippi, start up an organization and start a user group and see who you can get involved. You might surprise yourself. There's folks out there that want to learn and are always willing to contribute as their time allows. So that's really all I have. Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate you allowing me this opportunity and bringing me on, and keep doing what you're doing. Your work is fantastic. I love it. I can't get enough.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. Appreciate you. And thank you again. And until next time, we'll talk soon.
Awesome. Take care. Thanks.